Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be ranking my 10 favourite albums by the progressive rock band Yes. Now I have to explain right from the start that I am a progressive rock musician myself. That's how I define myself. This channel I talk a lot about jazz and jazz fusion, but I think progressive music and the progressive approach really influenced me as a musician. A lot of the bands that I like in the jazz and jazz fusion world tend to have those progressive elements in there as well. You know, like Miles Davis, The Mavish Structure, Return to Forever, Weather Report. All for me have progressive elements in there. And I grew up listening to a number of progressive rock bands, which I absolutely love to this day. And Yes is one of them. They're definitely in my top 3 progressive rock bands. I would say of the big progressive rock bands, the big famous ones, they probably are my favourite band. So as I start out on this little talk, I'd like to first off state where I'm coming from with this ranking. Yes, when you listen to a band like Yes, the thing that makes Yes brilliant, as with many great bands, is the signature sound of that band working together. I think the classic lineup with John Anderson, Bill Bruford, Rick Wakeman, Chris Squire, Steve Howe, all 5 of those are instantly recognisable by the sound of their instrumental playing. You know, Chris Squire defines a certain way of playing the bass. Bruford, for me, really put in my mind the idea that a drummer didn't have to sound like a standard rock drummer, that you could actually change the way you sound. You can also change the way you play the drums. That's a signature. Overridingly for Yes, that's the sound of Yes is defined for me by John Anderson. So as I start on this, you'll find there's very little non-John Anderson albums in here. So that discounts a lot of the more recent albums. I also feel after the 80s, the quality really dropped down in terms of the Yes albums. They seem to have diluted what they do somewhat. And I'm not familiar with every single new Yes album, so I've had a re-listen to some of those for this video, and I have included one album from the later period, which I think is absolutely wonderful. I heard it when it came out. I thought it was great, so I've put one in there, which actually on repeated listens is actually ranked quite high. So let's kick off this talk. So at number 10, I have the album Drama, which I think came out in 1980. Right, so straight away I've broken my rule because John Anderson's not on this. This was a later lineup for Yes, after classic Yes, towards the end of the 70s. I think Rick Wakeman and John Anderson, left during the making of this album, and they drafted in, it's a very strange choice, they drafted in the Buggles to replace them, which would be Jeff Downes on keyboards and Trevor Horn on vocals. Now, I think personally that the actual material on this album is very, very strong. I think it's stronger than the material that was on Tomato that went before. I think it's an aggressive sound there, which is great. There's also, they're pulling the songs in. The songwriting's really good, and this is why I think this album's important, because it bridges between the progressive rock of the 70s, which is very outlandish, and I've argued this on this channel, elsewhere. You can check this out. I think the idea that punk came along and destroyed prog is not true. I think what punk did is it came along, challenged prog, it challenged it in a certain way, where the clever musicians actually drew themselves in. And once you draw prog in, right, it becomes the most commercial sound on the planet. And so you see in the 80s pop music is not post-punk at all, it's post-prog. Yes were a band that drew themselves in and had a huge success, the biggest success they were ever going to have in the 80s. As was Asia. Asia was a prog supergroup that drew those prog credentials in, and they also had a #1 album and were the biggest band in the world in 1982 or when that album came out. And we see the beginnings of that on this album. We see Yes drawing themselves in. They're not totally drawn in. There's 2, wouldn't say epics, but there's 2 pretty outlandish tracks. Machine Messiah, which is absolutely fantastic, in the top 10 Yes songs of all time. Into the Lens is another longer track. And I think Trevor Horn, who's going to play such an important part later on, his voice is quite inconsequential and similar timbre-wise. No, nowhere near the character of John Anderson, but it doesn't grate. It's a similar sort of timbre. So you can forgive that. So yeah, at number 10 I have Drama. At number 9 I have the debut album, Yes. Now, when you listen to the debut album, it's not quite got the Yes sound. We haven't got... we've still got Peter Banks on guitar. He's a great guitarist. It's a great lineup. I thought the early Yes lineup needs to be represented because it's a great lineup. It's not as great as the Rick Wakeman, Steve Howe lineup, but a lot of the elements are there, but not all the elements are there. And there's a lot of cover versions on here. But for me personally, it ranks highly because when I came to Yes as a drummer, Bill Bruford really changed my idea of what rock drumming could be. I think the jazz influence is so important, but also his individual approach to sound, to the way the drums sounded, the way that he hit the drums, the way he phrased stuff, the way he didn't use the backbeat all the time. That was really influential for me. I discovered Bill Bruford on the Yes album, which has remained one of my favourite albums by Yes. And he's going to rank very high in this list. But I actually at the time read an interview with, an article in Kerrang about the best rock drummers. And it mentioned Bruford, and it said, you've got to check out the first album. Bruford's drumming on this is absolutely incredible, especially for 1968-69. He is so ahead of anyone else around the rock world. He's brought that jazz influence in, and he's really using it within a rock band, playing songs. And that was hugely influential. So for me, that's why it rates so high, and it's in at number 9. At number 8, I've actually gone for one of the later albums. I think it's a fantastic album called Magnification. I absolutely love the title track, the opening number on there. I think it's Yes at their absolute best. And I think the reason why this album works so well is because there's a little spanner in the works, and it is because there's no keyboardist on here. The keyboardist has been replaced by an orchestra. Now, of course, Yes are symphonic prog band. They are orchestral in their nature. Yes know how to do that. If there's one band that's going to be able to work with an orchestra, it's Yes. They tried to do it on their second album, Time of My Word, which is not an album I like, and I don't think they did that successfully. But of course, once you remove the keyboards out of it, right, the keyboards are acting in many ways in Yes as the symphonic aspect. So take the keyboards out and use the orchestra to replace the parts that Rick Wakeman or Patrick Moraz was doing. Suddenly it all makes sense, and it hardens up their sound. I think the later Yes albums can be a bit soft and wimpy, but once you've got the keyboards out there, you have to rely on Chris Squire's incredible bass sound, Steve Howe's incredible guitar sound. There's some incredible guitar playing from Steve Howe on this album. I think it's an absolute fantastic album. I definitely wanted to include one of the later albums on this list, so I checked them all out. I went back to that one. And I hadn't listened for it a while, and I was amazed at how good it sounded. So there it is. I didn't expect to rank it so high. I think Magnification is a great album. Right. Number 7, I have the epic, monstrous, and sometimes maligned Tales from Topographic Oceans. Okay? Now, when I was young as a huge Yes fan, I started to go through the albums, and I was very excited about getting Tales from Topographic Oceans. 4 epics, one after the other. I can remember being a full-on prog fan and being disappointed by that album when I first got it. I felt the 2 opening tracks, side 1 and side 2, were a bit meandery. And of course, Rick Wakeman's got on record of saying that he felt that it was one good album, that was stretched over 2 sides. As I've got older and I've listened to it again, I feel those first 2 epics, actually, when you look at the whole scope of the album, I don't know if it's older, I'm a bit more mellower, but I really think it's an incredible achievement what they did on there. They're really taking their time. I think if they had have come out early on, just blowing you away like Close to the Edge, how would you have then been able to sustain the listening? Because The Ancient, I absolutely loved as a kid. I think it's incredible. A lot of people don't like that, but I think it's so drum heavy that I loved it. And Ritual, of course, is absolutely fantastic. So it's grown on me as time has gone on. It's absolute classic Yes. It's doing everything that Yes should do. There's some incredible moments on there all the way through. And I think if you're going to make an album, which is basically 4 20-minute epics, you have to take your time. And so you have to take your time with this album. You know, I don't know what everyone else expects Yes to do at that point. You know, they could have done an ELP and started to make, you know, solo albums as an album, which ELP ended up doing on Works. I think maybe the year or following year. I mean, Yes solved that problem at this time by they all went away and did solo albums. But I think as a group effort, taking what Yes had pioneered on those early classic albums and taking it to the logical point, they did the right thing. It needs to be there. I think if they hadn't have done it, we would have all been asking ourselves why. So, but it's full of so many incredible musical moments that I think, yeah, at number 7 tells them from Topographic Oceans. So, at number 6, we have Relayer. Right, Relayer, which is the album that they made after Rick Wakeman had left, and they brought Patrick Moraz, you know, into the group. Patrick Moraz was more of a sort of fusion type player. To my ears, I think Yes had been listening to the Mahavishnu Orchestra and jazz fusion, and this wilder, more aggressive improvisational style comes in. It should be my favourite album by them because it's the fusion album. And for me, Gates of Delirium is possibly the greatest epic ever made, right? It could be. I did an album on prog epics, and I think I made Gates of Delirium number 1. But there's another one that's always challenging it for me, and we'll discuss that when we get to that one. They're both by Yes, by the way. I think that Yes were the greatest at making epics, but Gates of Delirium is absolutely sublime. It's Yes at their best. I was never that impressed with side 2, which I felt was a bit meandery, not in a sort of Tales for Topographic Oceans way, but in a sort of improvisational way. They're trying to play more fusiony, and they're not that type of band, and I don't think they quite pull it off. So I'm not saying it's terrible. What I'm saying is, whereas side 1 is 10 out of 10, side 2 for me is around about 7 out of 10. That's all it is. It's nothing like I hate it. I think there's some incredible moments on side 2. But for side 1, it does come up pretty high on my list at number 6. At number 5, right, and this would have been a lot lower on the list if I hadn't stuck that album in the car a couple of weeks ago, this album, and listened to it for the whole week. And this is going to probably horrify many prog fans out there. But at number 5, above Relayer and Topographic Oceans, I put 90125. Right? I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's one of the greatest albums of the 80s. I think the achievement of that album by Yes is incredible. Right? And it's because of the argument I gave earlier. Once you take progressive ideas, right, and you pull them in, you have the greatest pop music in the world. Progressive rock music is a British idea. After punk happened, which I actually think it should be classed as part of the progressive rock genre. Which is a really contentious idea. And if you want to know more about this, you can check out. I've done a video on this. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll put the link in the thing below. But when punk came out, it sort of, I feel, reminded the clever progressive rock musicians of what they were really about, and they pulled it back in. But progressive rock musicians are brilliant at melody, right? They're brilliant at that sort of high concept. They're brilliant at using technology. They're brilliant at portraying an English aesthetic, which has always been very popular. And so with 90125, all that gets pulled in. Right, but they do not compromise. Anybody who doesn't like it because they think it's an album of pop songs is not listening heavy enough, right? Because if you listen to it, what you'll hear... Sorry, I've just lost my list here, which is very important. If you listen to it, what you'll hear is all the things that Yes do, including a little mini epic, including all the vocal harmonies, Chris Squire's really weird bass lines, the off time drumming, time signatures, the mad arrangements, all that stuff, the symphonic elements, all of that is on that album. And I don't think there's a bad track on there. It's all sublime. It's absolutely incredible stuff. It's definitely one of the great albums of the 80s. And it opens the door for where progressive rock is going to go, you know. And I think that needs to be applauded. So when you hear later on Peter Gabriel doing things like Sledgehammer, and then bands like It Bites, and then the whole neo-prog thing and how that emerges, all of that, I think, all those bands, and I can say this, you know, being a member of Frost, is that when we, when Jem created Frost and I came in to help as I could, I think that album was a touchstone of how to do prog. It's very, very influential. And in a way, it maintains prog's position as a genre. So really, really important album. At number 4, we have the Yes album. All right. This album was the first Yes album I ever bought. The Yes album was the first Yes album I ever bought. But it's also the first progressive rock album I ever heard. So when I was at school, I had a picture disc of Silver Machine, and the guy at school really had his eye on this picture disc. He really wanted it, and he'd bought this album, which he said was unlistenable. I've got this album. He said it's really weird, but Andy, I know you're into weird stuff, so do you want to swap it for Silver Machine on picture disc? Which I did. And I took the Yes album home, and it was like a revelation. I'd been looking for this in rock music. I'd been looking for this sound, and it just absolutely blew me away. I can remember I listened to it over and over again and went to bed and like memorised the liner notes because I knew I was going to have to refer back to this. So the Yes album has a special place in my heart. It really defines Yes, I think, in terms of their sound, although it's not quite there yet. You know, I think, you know, Tony Kaye's still in the band, and I do love Tony Kaye's keyboards, but we still haven't had Rick Wakeman come in with his sort of arrangement skills and pull it all together. But an amazing album with absolute classic Yes songs on there. So many. I think Starship Trooper is in my top 3 Yes tracks. You know, probably at number 3. Right above that is Going for the One. Going for the One is a slightly later album, and it's, I think some people wouldn't class it as a classic Yes album. I do. I think they rock. They do everything that Yes should do on an album. It sounds great. It's a knowing album. You know, they know how to do it by that point. And I think in Awaken we possibly have the greatest, not just prog epic. I think it's possibly the greatest progressive rock track of all time. Absolutely perfect. If somebody said what's progressive rock, I'd probably play him Awaken. It's an absolute masterpiece. Not just Yes at their best, but the genre itself at its best. Incredible. At number 2 we have Fragile. Now Fragile, here we are, number 2. So I've ranked this really, really highly. And the thing with Fragile, it's an uneven album. You know, they're all doing their little solo bits on there. There's all these little interludes. You know, Bill Bruford gets to do this weird, you know, linear drum thing, and Rick Wakeman does his sort of overdubbed Brahms, you know, and Fish does his all these bass sounds and creating, you know. So there's all these little interludes, but these interludes are between some of the greatest Yes tracks ever, Roundabout, In the Heart of the Sunrise. And all the other tracks on there, I would say, are masterpieces. They're like classic Yes songs. So the only problem that you would have with this is the interludes. Well, that was really influential, mate. I love that. That broke the album up, and it takes you down little avenues, you know, and it balances these great big epics on there. But the epics are absolutely incredible. So yeah, it's hard to really talk about these last 2 albums because they are absolutely fantastic. Some of my favourite albums. So at number 2 I have Fragile. So of course at number 1 we have Close to the Edge. What can we say? It often gets voted as the greatest progressive rock album of all time. You know, multi-million selling, which is incredible when you think it's only got 3 tracks on there and one of the tracks is 20 minutes long. It's the peak of what Yes are about. It's the peak of what progressive rock is about. You know, created in 1972 when progressive rock was, you know, all encompassing before the critics got it, decided it was all pretentious tosh. And it's representing, you know, what rock music can do. You know, taking that thing that the Beatles had done with Sgt. Pepper and taking it to its natural conclusion with Close to the Edge and never putting a foot wrong. Absolutely incredible. All 3 tracks, I couldn't say which ones are the best. So that is my top 10 Yes albums. I hope you enjoyed that talk. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about progressive rock on this channel now. I think I've done the jazz thing a lot, and I've got a lot to say about progressive rock, so I'm going to be talking about those bands more. So if you want to hear more of that, please like this video, you know, hit the subscribe button, and most of all, put in the comments, tell me where I went wrong, and you know, why I should have put so-and-so album in. You know, obviously I don't know every Yes album inside out, so it is my personal, you know, top 10 based upon my own experience of listening to the band for 40 odd years. So thank you very much for listening. I'll see you soon. Bye.